was talking to families and being invited into their homes and into their lives to learn about their stories. And I started sort of really putting together that the stories were aligning with the science really in stunning ways. And that as a nation, we were focused on grief, the emotional response, but we were not focused on bereavement and bereavement systems around the families and how we orient those systems in order to facilitate what I call functional coping or adaptive processing. And so I've spent the better part of the last 10 years interviewing families, talking to great researchers like Emily and others, really putting together a bunch of puzzle pieces that I think over time has just really become illustrative that this is a massive problem hiding in plain sight. And I think Emily, who is now with us by phone, and unfortunately we won't get to see Emily today, Emily is one of the most prolific researchers that I've come across, and the mere breadth of what she's done in her contributions for grief and bereavement in this field are so substantial. And so I'm super honored to be able to introduce you to Emily today. This series, In the Know, is to interview experts in grief and bereavement. And so we have many more conversations coming your way in the next couple of weeks and months, hopefully with less technical difficulty, not just from Emily, but from us as well. So with that, I want to welcome Emily. It's so wonderful to have you with us today, and we really appreciate your time.
Yes, it's such a pleasure to be here. And again, I apologize that I'm coming to you by phone, but I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and having the chance to share some of my work with you.
Thank you. So Emily, if you could share, the area of grief and bereavement is unique, and many people come to this through just a wide variety of life experiences. And I wonder, how did you land? Can you tell us more about your journey here that has led to all of these really sort of astonishing connections that you've discovered between grief, bereavement, and the aftermath that individuals experience?
Yeah, so I am a sociologist by training. My PhD is in sociology and also demography, and I came to the field of sociology really interested in social stratification. And sociologists, we think a lot about mortality as indicative of social inequality because we know that poverty is, a key determinant of individuals' length of life. But coming from this, from the perspective of someone who grew up in, a really resource-constrained family, and who also, I lost a sister in a car accident at a young age, I was also, really always interested in kind of the more experiential dimension of, how social inequality intersects with mortality and how that's experienced by survivors, not just individuals who experience premature death. And so certainly this is a topic really kind of near and dear to my heart, just, from personal experience. And then in my PhD work, I was really interested in understanding, social inequality and disparities on a global scale. And so that took my work into international terrain. And again, my field of science thinks really carefully about differential length of life, right, as this very clear marker of this embodiment of social stratification. But again, what's really lacking from that is what this means, what these higher mortality burdens mean for survivors, for the people, navigating such a high amount of premature loss in their families and in their communities. And so my work is really trying to attend to that, right, to recognize that inequality in mortality conditions, also really means inequality in access to kin and social support, and this really unequal burden of bereavement that we see playing out across the globe.
Right. And I remember distinctly when I came across your COVID studies and your COVID multiplier effect. I had been talking about bereavement's multiplier effect actually for a few years, but didn't have any hard data at that time. And I took the multiplier effect terminology actually from economics. And that effectively for every one death, we had multiple people impacted. And because in the United States, we had at the time concurrent mortality epidemics, and this was before COVID, from suicide, homicide, overdose, and maternal mortality at the time. I think traffic fatalities have been up subsequently. And then, of course, now we have COVID. We knew that bereavement, or I knew that bereavement was a large social problem, but we didn't have the numbers to begin quantifying that. And tell us more about your study on COVID and the COVID multiplier. It's gotten a ton of attention and press, as it should, and would love to hear more about the nuances. And if you could walk us through, these graphs and what they mean.
Great. And so are you all looking at the first slide? Is that, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I can't see what you're, okay, perfect.
So we have a slide about the age distribution of COVID-19 bereaved.
Perfect. Yeah, so very early on in the pandemic, Ashton Verdery, who has done a lot of tremendous work on demographic microsimulations in the U.S., looking at kinship structures, we started chatting, about how we really wanted to be able to, rescale kind of the sense of how large this mortality crisis that we were kind of all staring down in the spring of 2020, how large it would actually be and how it would actually be felt and experienced by the population. So I had already been thinking about, aggregating like ways of kind of aggregating mortality trends from different vantage points to really understand, bereavement, for instance, and this remarkable analytic work that Ashton and his colleagues had already done. We were able to very quickly kind of combine these perspectives with this analytic approach and methodology that he had already established to generate this, bereavement multiplier. And so what this is it's a flexible tool that allows us to track really in lockstep fashion the rising death toll, how many people are bereaved for each COVID-19 death. And so this,
Emily, can I pause you for just a minute? Sabina, could you please back up to the first slide? Thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Emily.
No problem. And so what we wanted to do was get a sense of how this mortality shock was really going to reverberate across family systems in the U.S. And so what we found is that, regardless of kind of the epidemiological trajectory of the pandemic, that on average, we were finding, for each COVID-19 death, about 9 people we estimated would lose a close family member to COVID-19. And so a close family member here is defined as a grandparent, parent, sibling, spouse, or child. And so, really early in the pandemic, the narrative was that, this mortality shock was disproportionately affecting older adults. And so what this work shows us is, sure, we did see this very steep age gradient in risk of COVID-19 mortality, but how that affects people in terms of bereavement tells a very different story. So what you're looking at here is this age distribution of bereavement for each COVID-19 death. And what you can see is this very clear bimodal distribution, right? We see actually it's younger people who are, bearing the brunt of these losses because they're disproportionately losing grandparents and parents. And of course, we also see older adults losing relatives, predominantly spouses and siblings. So if you advance to the next slide, please. This tool also allows us to specifically look at who is being lost for each COVID-19 death. And so this attends to the fact that, we all play multiple roles in other people's lives. And so what we found is that, on average, each COVID-19 death leaves about 4 younger people without a grandparent, on average 2 people having lost a parent, 2 having lost a sibling. For every 2 deaths, 1 person loses a spouse, and for every 10 deaths, someone loses a child. And so this work has really allowed us to demonstrate the much, more dramatic scale by which COVID-19 mortality is affecting our population. And so if you advance to the next slide, because this multiplier allows us to really track how many bereavement events there have been in the midst of an ongoing mortality crisis. It's this very, nice flexible tool that allows us to actually extrapolate out, and to track, what this means over the course of the pandemic. So this graph here that you're looking at only extends to January of 2022, but what you see is that, by that point, more than 8 million individuals in the U.S. have lost a close relative to COVID-19. And as of last month, September, we estimate it to be about 9.4 million. And so this gives us a really different scale of the height of this mortality crisis by emphasizing, how many people have been intimately affected by COVID mortality.
I mean, this is just stunning data, and so important for us as we pursue public policy shifts and awareness on Capitol Hill and in the federal government. It also strikes me that we'll see similar multiplier effects, although we don't have the science on them yet, for other causes of death. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. This is a really novel and useful kind of way to think about bereavement, right? And we can absolutely extend this approach to other causes of death. And what I think is so useful about that is that there are some, I expect there will be kind of inversions sometimes, right? How some, less common causes of death may still have kind of an outsized effect in terms of bereavement, right? So I think it's a tool that absolutely we can use to really give a sense of the lingering effects of certain mortality crises that the U.S. is facing beyond COVID.
Yeah, and I think too, just with this particular data set or even other data sets in the kinship models that have been created, this doesn't account for extended family. This accounts for sort of more of a nuclear family connection. Is that right?
That's right, and I'm so happy you brought that up because in many ways, I mean, the scale of this work gives us this kind of astonishing scale, right? But actually, it's really only kind of capturing the tip of the iceberg. We are talking about, very close relatives. We're not capturing because of the limitations of our data. We're not able to, account for how many people have lost cousins, aunts and uncles, and also non-relatives, right? There's certainly we know there's a rich literature outlining how, losing non-relatives can have tremendous implications for people's lives. And we're not able to capture that here. And so I think what this, tells us is, our study is, providing a very conservative overview of kind of the scale by which we should be attending to COVID bereavement because it doesn't capture these more loose connections that still may have, very meaningful effects for people's lives.
And would you hypothesize that these impacts, let's take like a mass shooting, for example, how these deaths not just impact the nuclear family or even the extended family, but could ripple throughout communities?
That's exactly right. There is some really interesting and important work being done on these kind of more vicarious exposures to crises, right? So you mentioned, Joelle, mass shootings. And certainly we know that, there is research demonstrating that when a mass shooting happens, it affects everyone's mental health. We can see observable declines in mental health in the immediate wake of a mass shooting, right? So these crises affect us in very real, measurable ways, arguably perhaps more fleeting than if we were to lose a close relative, obviously, to a shooting, for instance. But nonetheless, I think it's a wonderful point that you bring up that, certainly those exposures are consequential too in their own right and deserve more recognition.
There is an interesting, just this last week in the Wall Street Journal, there was an interesting op-ed on whether or not the media should be following families after a mass tragedy events and televising or airing it on social media. And that the article the opinion piece didn't go into the around bereavement and sort of the implications for the individuals, and really having an additional loss, because the media is taking their story and sharing it with the world. But really, the point of the opinion piece was people need privacy in these very, vulnerable moments, and we really should be affording them more of it. And so I thought that was at least a promising piece, particularly, from the journal, beginning to recognize, at least tangentially, that these are such important and vulnerable moments for families, and affording them more privacy is really critical. So yeah, I'd love to move us to the next piece. So in looking at the COVID numbers and looking at grandparent loss, I mean, some people would say, well, grandparents are getting older, and so it's not as stressful as maybe a different, form of loss and so forth. And you've done some work on grandparent loss. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what the unique perspectives or aspects of that are?
Yeah, so just as you said, Drayle, I mean, typically we think of grandparental loss as kind of a rite of passage, right? We all experience it. It's kind of part and parcel to the human condition, having one generation replaced by the next. But even so, rarely do we attend to the fact that these are still, kind of big events in people's lives that could produce observable consequences for their well-being and for their just overall health and well-being going forward. And we were particularly motivated to start looking in this direction because, again, of the kind of narratives that were emerging during the COVID pandemic, right? So there's been so much emphasis on the consequences of the pandemic for children. And we've, talked a lot about, and there's been a lot of attention on school closures and distancing measures and the social isolation, of course, the economic shock that the pandemic created for so many families. But rarely in these narratives do we actually, attend to the fact that young people have been exposed to a ton of loss in their families as a result of COVID-19. And so in the preceding slides, we showed you that so much of the bereavement burden is being borne out by young people. Young people are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19, losses of grandparents. And so in this project, we are using pre-pandemic data, but we wanted to see, okay, are these deaths consequential? Can we actually observe that young people are affected when a grandparent dies? And so the data that we're using here is this, fantastic resource that followed a group of young children from birth all the way through to adolescence. And we have a lot of information on their mothers, who do disproportionately tend to be single mothers. And we also have information on their fathers and their grandparents, and a host of kind of markers of their well-being and health across the life course. And so what you're looking at here is this first analysis that we're doing to see if, having a grandparent die actually could affect young people's academic skills, right? And there's kind of two ways that we're thinking about this. I mean, one is obviously when you lose a grandparent, there's, the death event, there's the immediate bereavement, the grief that stems from that. But also there's just kind of this permanent loss of this very useful resource, right? Grandparents kind of act as a social safety net in the United States, particularly for single moms. And so we wanted to see, if having a grandparent die long ago or more recently has implications for youth's development of key academic skills. And so what you're looking at here is some pretty clear evidence. So these are just regression coefficients that tell you about the associations between having lost a grandparent and verbal ability, math ability, and reading comprehension. And what you can see is that boys in particular are very vulnerable to having lost a grandparent more recently. So in the first row, we don't see so much indication that having had a grandparent die at a very young age corresponds with lower cognitive skills, but we are seeing that more recently having a grandparent die corresponds with grandchildren having lower verbal ability, lower math ability, and lower reading comprehension at age 9. And this is, really striking because developing these skills on time is really important for youth's subsequent academic skills and their subsequent behavioral outcomes and academic outcomes. Interestingly, we're not finding anything in terms of young girls. And this, in some ways, this may be surprising. But I do, and this is just kind of a hunch, but I do wonder if it's how we kind of socialize boys into muting their grief, if that's why we're seeing this grief kind of rear its head, if you will, and show up in these disadvantages in terms of their academic skills.
This is stunning. And so just to make sure that I'm fully following, so when we're looking at boys here in the verbal, math, and reading abilities, there is between age 5 and between 5 and 9, and they have lost a grandparent, they are behind exponentially compared to their peers or girls.
Compared to other boys, yes. So
compared to other boys.
Yeah. So, and when we do in subsequent analyses, which I don't have with me today, but we are finding that actually effects on racial minority boys are really driving these effects. So disproportionately, it's Hispanic boys and non-Hispanic Black boys in particular that seem to have significant verbal ability, math ability, reading comprehension disparities when exposed to genital death between the ages of 5 and 9. And there's, again, kind of two explanations for why that could be the case. One is that in racial minority families, grandparents do play a particularly important role in children's lives. We know that co-residence is more common and kind of reliance on grandparents is more common, again, as this sort of social safety net. But also there's this, really interesting work emphasizing how not only do we tend to encourage boys to kind of, mute their grief, if you will, to not be as expressive with it, right? To be perhaps more stoic rather than, more expressive. There's also work emphasizing how racial minority boys in particular tend to have this quote unquote suffocated grief, right? This grief is viewed as, just bad behavior or acting out rather than, acknowledging that it's actually just their very normal reaction to a loss.
Sorry, this just continues to make, I'm sorry, I was on mute. It just continues to make the case that for continued bereavement services for youth for grandparent deaths, that grandparent deaths are consequential. They're particularly consequential for historically marginalized populations and particularly boys.
That's right. And obviously schools are such a clear site where we should be seeing, bereavement support being provided, because this is where we're observing that it's highly consequential to youth's outcomes. If you do go to the next slide, are you now looking at the depressive symptoms? Yeah, so in addition to looking like earlier in the life course at these academic skills, we also have work that is extending this framework to look at adolescents' mental health. So we know that, adolescents are at higher risk of mental health problems in terms of depressive symptoms in particular. And so we've also looked to see, what are the implications of having had a grandparent die for adolescent mental health? And again, we're mirroring the earlier findings in terms of cognitive outcomes. We're again finding clear evidence that boys in particular are more sensitive to grandparental loss when it comes to depressive symptoms. So the graph on the left side with the 3 bars pertaining to girls, we can see the height of those bars are all pretty comparable, right? So girls who had a grandmother die more than 7 years before they were age 15, or within 7 years since they were age 15, or a grandmother still alive, those girls all have pretty comparable risk of depressive symptoms. But if we look at the right panel, what we see is that boys who more recently suffered the death of a grandparent, so this is between roughly ages 9 and 15, these boys have significantly higher scores in terms of depressive symptoms relative to those who still have their grandmother alive. So again, this is reinforcing that these losses, not only affect young kids in terms of their their academic outcomes, but also can have real implications for youth mental health as well.
And we have a question from the group. Do we know if there are any, or if there have been any psychological interventions for this demographic?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any interventions geared towards grandparental loss in particular. I mean, and Joelle, you may be able to answer this question better, but my sense is that, most resources are focused on these, for good reason, these less common, kind of perceived as more perhaps stressful events in terms of like parental loss, right, or sibling loss. Rarely do we think about grandparental death as something that would merit intervention. And so I think this work is trying to, correct that perception, right? That even these losses are very common, they're in many ways anticipated losses, but they still have real effects for young people. Interestingly, in this adolescent mental health work, one question that we had was, well, are these effects kind of driven by the implications of their mothers? Because we're talking about maternal grandparents here. So,
right.
Are these effects driven by the fact that their mother had recently lost a parent, right? Because we know, adults who recently have lost an older parent, are at higher risk of substance abuse. They're at higher risk of poor mental health. But interestingly, we found that these effects operate distinct from the implications that a grandparent's death has for their mother. So what we're finding is that, grandchildren kind of have their unique reactions to these losses that extend beyond their parents' reactions.
Sure. And we have another question. Do you know if this is the same for step grandparents?
Oh, that's such a fascinating question, and I wish we had more data on this. We are focusing on maternal grandparents in particular. So even before getting into the family complexity dimension of this, we aren't able to very carefully even replicate these findings for paternal grandparents. So we do have some fathers in our data set, and we do have information on some of their parents, but it's a much smaller subsample. And so we are finding that generally we're finding the strongest effects in terms of maternal grandparents, less so in terms of paternal grandparents. And that could be because the fathers of these children are not typically as present in their lives as their mothers. They almost all co-reside with their mothers, and many do not live with their fathers. But I think this excellent point of, sometimes grandparents are, just as close as biological grandparents. Unfortunately, we only have data here on biological relations, but I think it's a fascinating question that certainly should be attended to. And I think a lot of it does depend on the nature of the relationship, right? How often grandchildren are seeing their grandparents, visiting with them, and kind of the role they have in their lives. Probably more so than biological relation alone.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, that I think just for everyone, for the purposes of the audience, that we are effectively on the cusp of a wave. And so I think what Emily's research shows us and others' research shows us is that bereavement is something that we need to be attending to in schools and communities and hospital systems and law enforcement departments and so forth. And so, so I think back, Sarah, to your question, I think there's just a much broader set of research that needs to be done as well. You know, that there's the step parents and larger psychological interventions and so forth. So I want to move us along because we still have 3 more things that we want to cover. Again, your work has just been so wide and varied. Really move us to global maternal bereavement burden. And I will also say that, you know, I've had the opportunity to read your papers, and you have a lot of other work that we're not going through today. I'm just hitting some of the high points, but global maternal bereavement, I, again, also found that absolutely shocking. And so can you begin to outline for us sort of the broad contours of that work? And we're going to go ahead and bring up some of your slides around this.
Great. So if you go to the next slide, if you're looking at these trend lines for different world regions, is that what's on your screen now?
Yep, that's what we're looking at.
Okay. Yeah. So you know, the kind of narrative in the global health community of late has been this, you know, really kind of celebratory focus on these dramatic declines in under 5 mortality rates that you're looking at here. So what you're observing is this, you know, remarkable improvement in terms of infant and under 5 health and survival across the globe over the last 50 years. And this has been the centerpiece of the global health community's focus on mortality conditions. But I've done a lot of work in Malawi and spent a lot of time there in Southeast Africa. And what doesn't square is, you know, how common child death still is in these communities, because what these rates attend to, what you're looking at, these are just annualized rates of, you know, how many children are dying as a function of how many births. But what it fails to consider is that, you know, women, of course, have multiple children often over the course of their lives. And so how these rates still kind of aggregate in populations is really quite different than the narrative that's kind of emphasized in the global health community. So if you go to the next slide, so there is animation, I believe, on this slide. So if you do click through to kind of highlight the whole map, that would be very helpful. But what you're looking at here is a work that we've done to actually provide a sense of scale of, you know, how many mothers are affected by under 5 child loss, focusing on under 5-year-olds because, of course, these are, you know, almost entirely preventable deaths, and where most of the child mortality is concentrated in the first 5 years of life. And so what you're looking at is these remarkably high burdens of child loss across the globe. And so this is focusing on relatively young moms, so mothers between the ages of 20 and 44 years old. So these are women still in kind of peak reproductive age. And what you can see here, these are estimates expressed per 1,000 mothers in the population. And so what you see is, you know, of course, in many sub-Saharan African countries, upwards of 300 to 400 or 30 to 40% of mothers have lost a child under the age of 5 at some point in their life, right? So we're taking kind of a cumulative perspective here to attend to having ever lost a child. And so this gives us, you know, a completely different sense of scale by which populations are still today very, very heavily affected by child loss. What we see is that not only, you know, is the sense of scale just kind of shocking that, you know, 30 to 40% of mothers have lost a child, but when we look closely at between country differences, what also emerges is that the inequality between women in African countries relative to the US or to high-income Asian countries or European countries is that the inequality there is so much larger than even inequality in infant mortality rates, right? So this work is trying to attend to this fact that losing a child is this, underappreciated kind of dimension of global health inequality that manifests in women's lives. And so if you go to the next slide, this is a repeated measure. And again, if you let the animation play out so that the entire map is filled out, please. What you can see is that when we look at mothers between the ages of 45 to 49 years old, so of course, these are women who have nearly completed or have completed their childbearing. What we see is that the burden of child loss is, of course, even greater among these women because they've had more time in motherhood and had more children. So again, in some sub-Saharan African countries, what we see is, upwards of 1/2 to 60% of mothers have ever lost a young child. Again, just, really fundamentally shifting what we think we know about child mortality conditions and how they're experienced across the globe.
Can you repeat that? So you're saying 50%, 1/2 of?
Yes.
Yeah, fill in the sentence just so I just to drive this home.
Yeah, so these levels are expressed per 1,000 mothers. And so if you see the legend in the darkest shading, that would be 600 to 700 or 699 mothers per 1,000. So the countries with the darkest shadings have anywhere from 50% to upwards of 60% of mothers between the ages of 45 to 49 will have ever lost a child under the age of 5. So it's in some sub-Saharan African countries, it's more common to have witnessed a child die than it is to have witnessed all of your children survive beyond the age of 5.
Goodness. And just thinking about this in full circle, going back from your very first slide. So as a globe, we are monitoring how long or how mortality among children 5 and under, but we are not monitoring sort of the aftermath on families or mothers and how many are losing a child or even losing a child who is older than 5 years old.
That's right. So if you could please go to the next slide, there's a final map and it should be shaded in a purple color if you let the animation go to completely fill out the map. What this does, Joyelle, is attend to the second point that you just made, that not only are we only focused on child mortality kind of from the vantage point of live births, right? Like we never think about how these, what this actually means for our parents. We also are kind of like globally fixated on this under 5 group, which is a very important group because these children are, more vulnerable to infectious disease, to malnutrition, and of course to premature death. But there's also a lot of, middle childhood and adolescent mortality across the globe. And this, also really affects parents' lives in addition to kids' lives, of course. And so what this last indicator does is extends this maternal perspective to think about just any child loss, regardless of the age at the time of the child's death. And so again, we see, that the scale of bereavement increases further, right? All across the globe, we see a greater appreciation for how much bereavement mothers experience by the age of 45 to 49. But we still see this dramatic inequality across the globe where, women in sub-Saharan Africa, select Southeast Asian countries have, disproportionately higher risk of having lost a child than mothers in other higher income enclaves around the globe.
And just to also punctuate, the Sustainable Development Goals There are 17 of them that the UN has focused on. Bereavement itself is not what's called an SDG, a Sustainable Development Goal. And so the SDGs effectively drive the world's philanthropy as the most pressing health and well-being issues. And by bereavement not even being a part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we are missing just such a massive opportunity to support and impact the lives of these mothers and many more. I mean, even going back to your COVID and thinking about your COVID multiplier effect and community impact. I mean, we're really talking about bereavement being a global public health problem, really at a scale that might be unfathomable to really even be able for me to digest.
That's right. I think this is a global phenomenon, right? And we can think about it in terms of, particular causes of death, or just, how unequal mortality conditions manifest in even, typical years, and how this plays out to, create some really massive but yet understudied global inequalities.
Sure. Let's move to the next slide here around intimate partner violence. Why don't you walk us through this slide and what it's showing us?
Yeah, so are you looking at this graph of child loss corresponding with IPV?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so what you're looking at here is this results from this project that really tries to attend to the implications of losing a child for mothers, particularly in these parts of the world where we see very high levels of child loss experienced by women. So there is this kind of callous narrative in my field of kind of assuming that, in high mortality conditions, that somehow losing a child may be less consequential, right? That it becomes kind of like an anticipated part of life. Similar to how, people kind of think about grandparental loss in the US. And so this project really wanted to see, well, what are the implications of losing a child? Do we actually see that this is really consequential for women's lives, even in these contexts where it's, pretty common to lose a young child? And so certainly there are some data constraints here. We lack really clear data on kind of women's well-being. Often women aren't studied in midlife in terms of their own health and well-being. Typically, we focus on them in terms of their reproductive health when we think about women across the globe in particular. But what we do have is some data on intimate partner violence, right, which is, sadly, another kind of epidemic across the globe, where we see in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa very high rates of intimate partner violence. And so we were curious to know, well, to the extent that child mortality is this, having a child die is this, major family stressor, does that actually, affect relationships to such a degree that we could see an elevation in women's risk of intimate partner violence? And there's good reason to think yes, right? There's this rich literature in the US on how losing a child, puts couples at higher risk of divorce. It leads to lower relationship satisfaction. And so we wanted to see, well, does this actually manifest into this very pernicious, outcome of violence? And we find very clear evidence that having lost a child corresponds with a subsequent increase in intimate partner violence in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, focusing mostly on those in West and Central Africa. We did find, and what you're looking at here, so this line above the zero indicates this significant effect of having lost a child on women's risk of experiencing intimate partner violence. But we did find some interesting evidence, and this is kind of the slope of the line, or the direction of the line, that this effect is strongest where fewer mothers have lost children. And so we do find some indication that, losing a child in particular in a community where rates of child loss are overall lower has some kind of outsized risk for women in terms of it creating, family stress to the point where we are able to observe an increase in intimate partner violence. And, we don't have clear data on what explains this effect, but we do suspect that, it has something to do with the fact that, taking care of young children and is predominantly women's work. That's the case everywhere in the world, and particularly the case too in sub-Saharan African countries. And so we do suspect that there may be some kind of processes of maternal blame going on here, where if women are predominantly charged with taking care of kids, that, of course, when a child does die prematurely, that there may be some blame processes going on, particularly in communities where mortality conditions have improved.
Emily, we have a question, and please send us your questions. Please submit your questions. We want to make sure that we wrap up. I'm sorry, the question actually just disappeared from my screen, but I think the question was effectively, how did women report, or did they self-report? How did you collect this data?
Yeah, good question. So these are face-to-face interviews where interviewers ensure privacy to the extent possible and ask women questions about IPV. Certainly there could be, concealed reporting, if a husband is within earshot, or if another family member is within earshot and the mother doesn't want to disclose IPV. Certainly, if anything, these are, conservative estimates of women's intimate partner violence reporting. That's a great question, because obviously these are very sensitive topics to ask women. And so there are some data collection protocols. I did not personally collect these data. These data are collected by the Demographic and Health Survey Program. And so they certainly have protocols in place to, increase the likelihood that women feel comfortable reporting. But, great point that certainly there are cases of IPV where women are probably not reporting it in the context of the interview.
Yeah, and there's another point here that mortality self-blame is making them less likely to leave bad marriages. I'll say on the IPV piece, and we need to move on, we want to make sure that we just cover, at least even briefly, fertility and bereavement's impact on fertility. But I thought, from what you've said and what I've read, how fascinating it is that IPV was, if I remember this correctly, was more common in gender equal education environments and other environments where infant mortality was less common. You saw more intimate partner violence.
And specifically, we saw more intimate partner violence in the case of having lost a child. So not overall, but for bereaved moms in particular. So it suggests that where child loss maybe isn't as expected, it's less common. There's less of a support system in place for when you do lose a child, because it's just a less common experience in the community. We do see that comes with an outsized risk of IPV, which again points to potentially some, maternal blame processes going on. And I love the point that someone brought up about self-blame, right? That may lead women to, stay in really violent marriages because they themselves are, internalizing this as somehow being their fault. I think that's a really fascinating point, and one that I had not thought of.
We have another, how much of this intimate partner violence / child loss is related to violence from the partner?
That's a really great question. And so what you're touching on is kind of how the literature has, often thought about this connection between child mortality and IPV. And so kind of another motivation for this work was that there's this huge literature showing that women who have experienced IPV have higher risk of their child dying before age 5 in poor countries. And so there's this association that's been documented in past research studies linking IPV to child mortality through the hypothesized mechanism of violent men being bad for both women and children. But when we looked closely at this work, what was shocking was no one had ever attended to the temporal ordering of these events, right? They had not attended to the fact that sometimes the child mortality happened prior to the IPV. And that's what we did in this paper, to say, no, child mortality is not just an outcome of these other social processes. It actually is a disadvantaged experience that sets other disadvantaged, experiences into play, right? And so when we actually so what we do in this paper is really carefully attend to the fact that, we make sure that the child death event actually happened prior to the onset of the intimate partner violence, so that we can kind of parse that, messy relationship in a much more careful way than it has been done in past research.
So Emily, we really only have a minute left at this point. Do we want to? Is there one slide that you want to just share with us, maybe in conclusion, on fertility?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, and so there is one other paper that, I guess this work is trying to attend to two different things that we've not gotten to in our conversation yet. One is that we've been talking about these very intimate losses, right? Having someone in your family die. What we do in this last project is actually think about just these more vicarious exposures that we talked a little bit more about, Joyelle. Like, what are the implications of losing other people outside of your family in your social network? And so in this project, we're doing that, and we're trying to understand, what this means for women's lives. What are the implications of just losing more people in your social network? And what we find is that it puts women at elevated risk, again, with very careful measurement, of experiencing unintended pregnancy, of experiencing this other, again, like kind of form of disadvantage that stems from the instability, the stress, the uncertainty that comes with bereavement.
And just to make sure that we're looking at the slide with the countries listed on the left and the multicolored arrows.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. You're off. So if you go to the very last slide.
Okay. There we go. Yeah. So this stepwise fashion, effectively.
Exactly. So what we're seeing here is, and this work is focused in Malawi, where we know there's a lot of community mortality that women are navigating. And what we find is that this higher burden of social network mortality, of losing people in your life, corresponds with this elevated risk of subsequently experiencing an unintended pregnancy, which we think, again, similar to the IPV work, is attending to just how, bearing the burden of coping with so much loss and so much grief and bereavement, can play out to disadvantage women in really varied but important ways subsequently.
So we have one last question, which is another one piggybacking off the last one. All of this seems to come from a place of coercive control violence. Do we know anything about situational couple violence?
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm not sure if you mean like a more emotional violence, but here we are not talking about IPV. There's this, really massive return, and I am not an expert in IPV, and so I may be overstepping here. But it's a hard thing to measure and to think about, like, what is intimate partner violence. I mean, some cases are very clear. Others, we get into like more coercion, emotional abuse. So here we are talking about very severe sexual and physical violence that we are observing and would be relevant to also the unintended pregnancy, but certainly I think the coercion piece and other. I'm not sure if I'm attending to the question, but I think that certainly needs to be unpacked in more research, right? Like, what kind of violence and abuse are we specifically talking about here?
Yeah, there's so much here, and And before we close up, where can people find you and all of your wonderful body of work and your papers?
Yeah, so I do have a website. I'm also at the University of Southern California. So certainly you can find me and my email there. I'd be happy to share any papers that are behind paywalls with you. I also have a website that I hope you visit. And again, my sincerest apology for the technical difficulties, but I am so happy that this conversation happened. And thank you so much for all of your very thoughtful questions and comments. It gave me a lot to think about.
Emily, thank you for being here. We hope that your internet comes back soon. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next month.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.